At 4:17 in the afternoon on February 28, commercial satellite imagery from Maxar Technologies captured something that contradicted 3 months of official Pentagon assessments. 17 Chinese naval vessels, including 4 destroyers and 2 amphibious assault ships, had positioned themselves in a precise formation 73 nautical miles east of Taiwan's main port at Kaohsiung. The formation was not a transit pattern, it was not a training exercise, it was a blockade configuration that maritime analysts had been warned to watch for, but had been assured would not materialize without weeks of observable preparation. When the imagery was released to the public 4 days later, on March 4th, the official characterization had already become untenable. China had established operational control over Taiwan's primary commercial shipping corridor without firing a single shot, and the satellite evidence made denial impossible. Subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications before going any further. What happened 73 nautical miles from Taiwan this week is not simply a military positioning maneuver. It is an economic siege whose consequences will compound for months regardless of what happens in diplomatic negotiations. The pace at which the operational picture is diverging from official communications means you cannot afford to be behind this analysis when the next development breaks. When the next satellite pass confirms what briefing rooms have not addressed, when the next shipping route closure produces the cascading effects that official statements have minimized, the analysis will be here. To understand the full weight of what those 17 vessels represent, it is necessary to first understand what Kaohsiung actually means to Taiwan's economy and to the global technology supply chain, because this was not an attack on a military installation. It was a precision strike against the economic jugular of the world's semiconductor manufacturing infrastructure. Kaohsiung handles 47% of Taiwan's total container throughput annually. It processes the overwhelming majority of the island's exports of integrated circuits, advanced semiconductor components, precision machinery, and specialized chemical compounds that feed manufacturing operations across North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which produces 92% of the world's most advanced chips, routes 68% of its finished product exports through Kaohsiung's container terminals. Apple, Nvidia, AMD, Qualcomm, and every major technology manufacturer dependent on cutting-edge semiconductor nodes all rely on shipments that move through this single port facility. For advanced chip exports below 7-nanometer process nodes, Kaohsiung is not one of several options. It is the only option that exists at the required scale and technical specification handling capacity. That geographic and infrastructural reality is the strategic context without which the Chinese naval positioning cannot be properly understood. Beijing did not blockade one of several export routes, it blockaded the only route through which the technology that powers artificial intelligence development, advanced weapons systems, data center operations, and consumer electronics manufacturing can reach global markets at current production volumes. The 17 vessels positioned 73 nautical miles from Kaohsiung represent the most consequential economic leverage operation of the 21st century, and it was executed without the military escalation that Western defense planning had assumed would be necessary for China to achieve this level of economic coercion. The timeline of official acknowledgement tells its own story about information control and narrative management. Maxar's commercial satellite passed over the formation at 4:17 p.m. on February 28. According to sources familiar with U.S. Indo-Pacific Command protocols, military reconnaissance satellites had identified the formation no later than 2:30 p.m. that same afternoon. Pentagon officials were briefed on the positioning by 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The first public statement from the Department of Defense came 41 hours later, on March 2nd at 11 a.m., characterizing the Chinese naval movement as routine training operations consistent with seasonal exercise patterns. That characterization held for exactly 37 hours, until Maxar released the commercial satellite imagery to Reuters on March 4th at 9 a.m. showing 17 vessels in a formation that no maritime analyst with operational experience could credibly describe as a training exercise. The formation itself demonstrates tactical sophistication that NATO naval planners have been warning about in classified assessments for the past 18 months. The 4 destroyers established an outer perimeter at intervals of approximately 19 nautical miles, creating a defensive screen against potential interference from US or Japanese naval assets operating in the Philippine Sea. The 2 amphibious assault ships positioned themselves at the formation's center, serving as command and control nodes, with the helicopter and drone capacity necessary to maintain persistent surveillance across the entire blockade zone. 11 smaller vessels, a combination of corvettes and fast attack craft, filled the interior spacing at intervals calculated to ensure that no commercial shipping could transit the corridor without coming within effective weapons range of at least 3 separate platforms. This is not speculation. This is confirmed by Lloyd's of London Maritime Security Assessments distributed to major shipping insurers on March 5. According to those assessments, which have been verified by multiple independent maritime security firms, the spacing and weapons coverage of the Chinese formation creates what actuarial analysts call an uninsurable transit zone. Commercial vessels cannot obtain coverage for passage through waters where weapons engagement is not just possible, but geometrically certain, if transit is attempted without explicit Chinese authorization. And without insurance coverage, no major shipping company will authorize their vessels to enter the corridor, regardless of what diplomatic assurances might be offered. Now to the question that defense analysts across the ideological spectrum are examining with increasing urgency: why did this happen now? And why did it happen without the military escalation that every major wargame scenario had predicted would be necessary? The answer lies in a technological and operational shift that has fundamentally altered the economics of naval power projection. China has spent the past 7 years developing and deploying what Western naval intelligence calls layered coastal denial architecture, a network of land-based anti-ship missiles, over-the-horizon radar systems, and autonomous underwater sensor networks that can establish effective sea control out to approximately 200 nautical miles from the Chinese mainland without requiring the traditional blue water navy that would have been necessary to achieve the same operational effect 2 decades ago. The DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile, which achieved initial operational capability in 2019, has a confirmed range of 1,800 kilometers and carries a maneuvering re-entry vehicle capable of terminal course corrections that make interception with current Aegis system technology extremely difficult. Each DF-21D launcher costs approximately $42 million to produce and deploy. A single U.S. aircraft carrier strike group costs approximately $26 billion to build and operates at an annual cost of approximately $1 billion. The mathematics of this engagement calculus are not subtle. China can threaten carrier operations across the entire Western Pacific with a missile arsenal that costs less than a single carrier strike group, and it can do so from land-based positions that do not require the vulnerable forward deployment that blue water naval operations demand. That technological shift explains why the blockade formation includes no aircraft carriers and no large surface combatants beyond the 4 destroyers serving perimeter security functions. China does not need carrier-based air power to maintain sea control in waters less than 200 nautical miles from its own coastline, when land-based systems can provide the same coverage at a fraction of the cost and risk. The 17 vessels positioned east of Kaohsiung are not there to fight a naval battle. They are there to serve as the visible enforcement mechanism for sea control that land-based systems have already established. Commercial shipping companies understand understand this calculus perfectly. The vessels they can see on satellite imagery are not the primary threat. The missiles they cannot see, positioned along the Chinese coast with coverage extending across the entire Taiwan Strait and beyond, are what make the transit corridor operationally closed, regardless of what military assets the United States might deploy in response. If this channel is giving you the analysis this situation deserves, the kind that explains mechanisms rather than just reporting events, subscribe now and share this video with anyone trying to understand what is actually happening behind the daily headline cycle. When the next shipping data confirms what insurance markets have already priced in, when the next semiconductor shortage produces the consumer electronics delays that official statements have not prepared markets for, when the next diplomatic exchange reveals the leverage calculations that this blockade has created, the analysis will be here. Evidence first. What it means for you always. The economic consequences of what is happening militarily have now reached a scale that extends far beyond the Indo-Pacific theater and into the daily economic reality of people in countries with no direct involvement in this confrontation. And understanding the specific mechanisms by which this naval positioning is generating those consequences is essential to understanding why they will not resolve quickly even if the blockade dissolves tomorrow. Kaohsiung's container throughput has dropped from an average of 173,000 20-foot equivalent units per week to approximately 18,000 TEUs as of March 9th. That reduction is not a temporary disruption that shipping schedules can absorb. It is a supply chain rupture that will take a minimum of 9 to 14 months to clear even after normal operations resume, because the ships that would have called at Kaohsiung have been rerouted to alternative ports that do not have the capacity to handle the displaced volume. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturer Company has confirmed in communications with major customers that chip shipments scheduled for March and April will experience delays ranging from 3 to 7 weeks. Apple has already informed suppliers that iPhone production targets for the second quarter will be reduced by 12 to 18%. NVIDIA has issued guidance to data center customers that H100 GPU deliveries will be pushed back by a minimum of 6 weeks. The automotive sector, which was just beginning to recover from the chip shortages that plagued production from 2021 through 2023, is facing a new wave of assembly line shutdowns as Taiwan-sourced microcontrollers and power management chips become unavailable. The weekly economic cost of Kaohsiung's effective closure is approximately $4 to $6 billion in direct trade value. That figure represents only the immediate transaction value of goods not being shipped. It does not include the cascade effects in manufacturing delays, inventory carrying costs, and lost production capacity across dependent industries. Break that down by sector and the scale becomes clearer. Semiconductor exports alone account for approximately $1 billion per week in direct value. Precision machinery and manufacturing equipment represents another $600 million weekly. Chemical and pharmaceutical precursors add $400 million. Consumer electronics components and finished goods contribute approximately $800 million per week. The remaining value comes from a dispersed range of specialized industrial products and materials that feed supply chains across multiple manufacturing sectors. For consumers in the United States, Europe, and other major economies, these disruptions will begin manifesting as price increases and product availability problems within 4 to 8 weeks. Laptop computer prices have already increased by an average of 7 to 11% across major brands as retailers anticipate chip shortage impacts and adjust pricing accordingly. Smartphone release schedules are being quietly pushed back, with Samsung and Google both delaying product launches that were scheduled for late April and early May. Automotive dealers are reporting that delivery times for new vehicles have extended from the normal 4 to 6 week range to 12 to 16 weeks for models dependent on advanced driver assistance systems and electric powertrains. The insurance market response provides perhaps the clearest signal of how seriously financial institutions are taking the situation. war risk insurance premiums for commercial vessels transiting within 300 nautical miles of Taiwan have increased from the baseline rate of 0.05% of vessel and cargo value to between 0.8 and 1.2%. For a container ship carrying $200 million in cargo, that represents an increase from $100,000 to as much as $2.4 million in insurance costs for a single voyage. No shipping company can absorb those cost increases while maintaining profitable operations on the routes that serve Taiwan, which means those routes are now economically non-viable, regardless of whether the Chinese blockade directly interdicts vessels or not. The actuarial mathematics of war risk insurance have effectively accomplished what a shooting war would have required direct military action to achieve. Commercial shipping has been economically severed from Taiwan without China firing a shot, or the United States facing a military escalation decision that would require immediate response. This is economic warfare executed with a precision that traditional military operations could not match, and it exploits a vulnerability in the global trading system that defense planners categorically failed to account for in their contingency planning. The broader strategic question that emerges from assembling all of these elements is the one that analysts across the ideological spectrum are beginning to ask with increasing urgency. Can the United States credibly maintain its commitment to Taiwan's security when the economic leverage that China has now demonstrated makes military confrontation potentially unnecessary for achieving Beijing's core objectives? Both American and Chinese officials are projecting confidence in their respective positions. The battlefield reality, or in this case the commercial shipping reality, suggests something considerably more complicated. The most consequential shift in the Indo-Pacific balance of power in 3 decades arrived just days after Pentagon officials were publicly stating that Chinese capabilities for effective blockade operations remained years away from operational maturity. That contradiction may be the most revealing data point of the entire confrontation. What the satellite imagery captured on February 28 was not simply 17 vessels in formation. It was the manifestation of a strategic doctrine that has been developing largely outside of Western analytical attention for the better part of a decade. China's military modernization has focused not on matching American carrier strike group capabilities, which would require decades of development and hundreds of billions in investment, but on developing the specific systems necessary to deny American carrier operations in waters adjacent to the Chinese mainland. The DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles, the Type 055 destroyers with their advanced air defense systems, the expanding network of artificial islands in the South China Sea equipped with runway and sensor facilities, and the growing fleet of diesel-electric submarines optimized for coastal denial operations all serve this single strategic objective. Western defense planning has been oriented around the assumption that China would need to achieve near parity with U.S. naval capabilities before attempting to assert control over Taiwan. That assumption has now been demonstrated to be comprehensively wrong. China does not need to match American blue water naval power, it needs only to make American carrier operations in the Western Pacific sufficiently costly and risky that political leadership in Washington concludes that the defense of Taiwan is not worth the potential loss of a carrier strike group and the thousands of personnel aboard. The 17 vessels positioned east of Kaohsiung represent the visible component of a broader capability demonstration designed to communicate exactly that calculation. The implications extend well beyond Taiwan. If China can establish effective sea control and economic isolation of an island nation 90 miles from its coast without triggering military confrontation with the United States, what does that capability demonstration mean for other contested territories and maritime disputes throughout the Indo-Pacific? The Senkaku Islands, which Japan administers but China claims, sit even closer to the Chinese mainland than Taiwan does. The Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, where multiple nations maintain competing territorial claims, fall well within the range of the coastal denial systems that China has now demonstrated it can employ effectively. The entire First Island chain, which U.S. defense planning has long treated as a defensive perimeter that could contain Chinese maritime expansion, looks considerably more porous when viewed through the lens of what has just been demonstrated east of Kaohsiung. Here is where the complete picture stands on day 11 of this confrontation. 17 Chinese naval vessels remain in blockade formation, 73 nautical miles east of Taiwan's primary commercial port. 0 commercial vessels have attempted to transit the corridor since March 2nd. Kaohsiung's container throughput has declined by 89% from baseline averages. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company has confirmed shipment delays affecting approximately $40 billion in annual customer revenue. War risk insurance premiums for Taiwan transit routes have increased by 1,600%. The United States has deployed 2 additional destroyers to the Philippine Sea, but has made no move to challenge the blockade formation directly. China has achieved all of this without a single weapons discharge, without violating any explicitly defined international boundary, and without providing the United States with a clear military escalation that would justify direct intervention. This is the strategic logic that the satellite imagery captured and that official communications spent 4 days attempting to characterize as something other than what it plainly was. The evidence was always going to become public. Commercial satellite imagery is available to any media organization or research institution willing to purchase it. The delay in official acknowledgement was never about preventing public awareness. It was about maintaining narrative control for as long as possible before the evidence made continued denial untenable. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications when the next shipping data release quantifies the supply chain disruptions that official statements have minimized, when the next earnings calls from semiconductor and electronics manufacturers detail the revenue impacts that diplomatic optimism has obscured, when the next satellite pass captures developments that briefing rooms will struggle to explain, the analysis will be here. This channel documents the gap between official characterization and operational reality. Evidence first. What it means for you always. Leave one question in the comments before you go. Can current American naval doctrine maintain credible deterrence in the Western Pacific when the economics of coastal denial have shifted this dramatically in China's favor? Or are we watching the architecture of forward presence being tested in ways it was not designed to survive? Every response gets read and considered. This is the analysis that connects satellite imagery to your economic reality.